Thank you, Rich. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to speak at this conference. I heard that I have 10 minutes, so I'm just going to get to the meat, or, with all due respect to vegetarians. So, Quebec after the election. Well, first, let's look at the results of that election and try to understand the impact of it. And it's hard to overestimate the impact of that particular election. But I think we need to go back to 2012, at least, to figure that out. I'm going to read a rough translation of something I said during one of the debates during the campaign. In 2012, the Liberal government provoked deliberately a crisis by announcing an increase of 75% of tuition fees. And it let the situation rot and get worse by ignoring the movement against that policy of theirs and refusing any kind of compromise. Then they fed stereotypes about their opponents and pretended and claimed to be speaking on behalf of the silent majority. At the end of that process of crisis, they ended up putting forward a bill that was attacking fundamental rights: right to demonstrate, freedom of association, right to strike. In the case of students, the first time ever that right was questioned. And ultimately, they called an election and they lost. 2 years later, the Parti Québécois government provoked the crisis on their own by announcing their intention to ban religious symbols for workers in the public sector. They let the situation get worse and worse by refusing to make any kind of compromise. They encouraged all kinds of preconceived ideas and caricature of their opponents, and were claiming to speak on behalf of the silent majority. They introduced a bill that was attacking fundamental rights: the right to work, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. Ultimately, they ended up in an election, and they lost. This scenario, to me, is extremely important to understand what's going on in Quebec now and what's likely to happen in the near future. A bit like in Ontario, there was also the option of a hard right. In the case of Quebec, it's called CAQ, la Coalition Avenir Québec. That's a bit the equivalent of your Conservatives, and with Hudak and all that. But the Liberals and the PQ are not from that type of party, but when in power, recently they tried what I would call radical right-wing policies, and they failed. They both failed. They both lost, and they both lost the election that came up after they tried that major shift to the right. So we now have a government in Quebec, a Liberal government, that is, of course, entirely committed to the neoliberal or austerity view of things, but they're also really scared. They're scared of the capacity of people in Quebec to mobilize and to organize and to stop them. So they're walking on eggshells. They're still walking in the same direction, but they are walking on eggshells, and they're being really careful with the rhetoric. Just a very small example, Prime Minister Couillard, when he was accused of being for austerity, he said, no, it's not austerity, it's rigueur, which means, we're just being reasonable. It's just being reasonable or being rigorous. We're being rigorous in the way we manage public funds. He rejected even the word austerity because he's afraid that people might rally against him around that word. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, that election was the PQ's to lose, and they lost it in a major way. Another way in which that election is very significant is the impact it's going to have on the PQ, because they had their worst result since they were formed in 1968. The last poll gave them 20%. They had 20% when they formed the party in 1968. It is really, really massive in terms of what the future can possibly bring for the PQ. And good riddance. Because what they did to try to stop their decline is appeal to the worst in people, is appeal to scapegoating of minorities. And that's something that the PQ would not have even considered doing a few years ago. But they embraced that strategy 100%, and now they painted themselves into a very ugly corner and they can't get out of it. So I'm going to move on to the second half, which is what do we need to do now? I think in order to fight the liberals, the liberal government, we need to build resistance in social movements in various ways. And two very clear examples right now are the fight against the pipelines. Very recently, there was a march that went from Kakuna all the way to Kanesatake, so basically all through the most populated areas of southern Quebec, with a lot of involvement of people from First Nations and also environmentalists. That it was mentioned in an earlier session, that an advisor of Harper's was saying, oh, if environmentalists and Native people come together, we're going to be in trouble. It's happening in Quebec as well. And Quebec-Ca supports that struggle fully. During the election campaign, we were the only political party to even talk about climate change as a problem, and we put forward a plan to transition away from the oil economy in 15 years. Just get rid of it altogether by 2030. We were called dreamers, and people said we were living in a fantasy world, but really, living in a fantasy world is thinking that you can keep going, doing what we're doing right now, and not have to pay a heavy price for that. Another big struggle that we're going to have to support over the next little while are major, we can anticipate major labor struggles. There's already a big fight going on as we speak on the issue of pensions for municipal workers all over Quebec. There's a big coalition around that. The rest of the labor movement needs to come forward and support that fight, because if the bosses' government and the bosses get away with basically stealing money from the pensions of workers, what are they going to do next? We need to come together to win that one, but then immediately after that there's going to be the fight in the public sector for the whole provincial public sector workers, so 450,000 people, including myself, will be in bargaining next year. So that's going to be a big issue. But in the following session, later today, we're going to talk more about those questions. Another thing we need to do, obviously, is take on the leadership on the national question. The left has to take over the leadership on the national question, where we've had the habit now for 40 years that the national question was chasse gardée, or was owned by the Parti Québécois, but that's over. The Parti Québécois has failed miserably, and it's time for the left to take back that issue and give it a working class and democratic and environmental content. The PQ, for their 40 years of existence, what they've done is hollow out the national struggle, turn it into basically a balloon, like something completely superficial with nothing inside. We have to go back to the roots of the national struggle from the 60s and add to it all the new movements on environmental questions, feminism, and so on. And that's what Quebec-Ca is going to try to do. And one more thing we need to do, and I'll end on that for my 10 minutes, we need to challenge what I call fiscal populism. People like Hudak and others that you know very well, and CAC on our side, like the ugly part of the fact that the PQ is now third is that the second party in Quebec is now CAC, which is worse than the PQ on economic issues, and it's a more aggressive bosses party. And if the struggles are successful, if the movements are successful in blocking the liberals, as we were with the Charest liberals to some extent, very recently, there's a chance that the ruling class is going to decide to go for Plan B and support CAC and try to bring into power a government that is brutally anti-worker, anti-union, and the way that they win that kind of support is through fiscal populism. They tell people, if you vote for us, there's going to be more money in your pocket. And paradoxically, that is appealing actually to a lot of working class people who have less money in their pockets. And I can tell you, even CAC candidates, I had CAC candidates during debates in the election campaign sitting beside me saying really progressive working class stuff and then stumbling into the CAC rhetoric about we have to cut the bureaucracy and reduce taxes. There's a lot of contradictions in the heads of the people who support that party. And Quebec-Ca has to be able to talk to these people and say, no, what is in your best interest is to support us. There's going to be a tendency in Quebec-Ca to say, oh, but we're still fourth, and we only got 7.5%. How come more people don't vote for us? Maybe we're too radical. What we need to do instead is argue that the radical ideas that we are putting forward, like getting out of the oil economy, Quebec independence, ending the austerity policies, those radical ideas are in the interest of the vast majority of the people, and we need to go to the people and talk to them and bring them together to build an alternative. Thank you. In 2014, I have yet to hear about a single organization in the union movement in Quebec who actually called for a vote for the PQ. I don't think there was one. Not one. But several organizations called for a vote for QS, including the Montreal Central Council of CSN, the Central Council of FTQ, also in Montreal, called for a vote for several individual QS candidates, not for the party as a whole, but still. There was more support for QS than ever before, and the rest of the union movement just stayed quiet. Let's see what happens in 4 years, but I think we can be very hopeful. A lot of stuff was said about students. What was the relationship between the student movement in 2012 and Quebec-Ca, or more broadly, the student movement and QS? I think the student movement was very happy that we were supporting them, but they would not call for a vote for QS. There's no tradition at all in the student movement of explicitly calling for a vote for a party or another, not even in the organizations that are historically very close to the PQ. They wouldn't explicitly do that. So the student movement is staying away from partisan politics. It's their tradition. They're allowed to have that particular tradition. But at the same time, it's no coincidence that the membership of Quebec-Ca doubled during 2012. A whole lot of young people joined the party during the strike because they could see that Quebec-Ca was supporting them all the way, from Amir Kazé all by himself in the National Assembly, all the way to Manon Massé, walking in downtown Montreal every night. So they knew we were there. Quick thing on the national question and the student movement. Again, a little example from my personal experience. When I was a student activist myself in '86, and we were on strike for just 2 weeks, the idea of a 7-month strike was completely far-fetched back then. During those 2 weeks, I was kind of a local spokesperson a little bit, and I gave an interview to a right-wing nationalist radio host. And he told me, why should we support you, students? You're lazy, you're complaining, you're a bunch of whiners, you're enfant gâté, why should we support you? And I brought up one argument. There are still a lot less people in Quebec getting a university diploma than there are in Ontario. There's still a lot less francophones in proportion getting a higher education than anglophones inside Quebec. So as long as we haven't caught up with the rest of Canada and with the English-speaking community in Quebec, we can't put any barrier to access to post-secondary education. So I kind of got him with a nationalist argument, but from the left. And he didn't have anything else to say after that. And I think that's part of the logic of why in the student movement in Quebec there is a component of the national question that's there, even if it's not always explicit. I could expand on these things, but I'm going to end with just one thing. That when I knew that I was going to speak at Marxism this weekend, I thought there's one thing I need to say to everybody. I'm going to say it now. We live in a world that's pretty awful when you look at the whole thing. Like, there's really terrible things going on the planet right now. The climate crisis, wars, civil wars, oppression, violence. Like, it's really nasty, the world we live in right now, and sometimes it's hard to keep hoping for a better world. Sometimes you just want to give up and just watch TV and drink wine and forget about the whole thing. And then something happens, like what happened on April 7th, Manon Massé getting into the National Assembly, and Pauline Marois losing in her own riding. And those little things just bring my spirits up in a major way and make me think there's still hope for humanity.